Schilling Show, Monday edition, 977-1070 is the phone number for legal analysis. We go now to Byron Henry, attorney. On the Supreme Court and the Trump travel ban, what are the legal principles here, and where is this likely to go? Hey, Byron, welcome back to the Schilling Show.
Great to be with you, Rob.
All right, would you help us understand what the proposal is? I think we've gotten lost in a lot of the coverage of the legal specifics, but what is the president attempting?
Well, the president is appealing an en banc ruling by the entire Fourth Circuit, which basically left an injunction in place blocking his temporary travel ban while the case works its way up through the system. The injunction stops the travel ban early in the case, before the case is even over, and that was appealed, and it was affirmed by a court of appeal. Now it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has a few choices. The first choice is whether they issue a stay. A stay in this case would basically stop the Court of Appeals decision from going into effect and allow the travel ban to go into effect. So that's obviously a home run for the Trump administration, because that would basically allow the travel ban to go into effect while the Supreme Court was deciding the case. That takes 5 votes from the Supreme Court to achieve. Short of the 5 votes necessary to allow his travel ban to go in effect immediately upon review by the court, it takes 4 votes to grant the case and actually take the case and review it, which most commentators and observers expect the court will do, and take the case to review based on the propriety of the travel ban, and that only takes 4 votes. And that, of course, is what they're considering now, and they've ordered the plaintiffs in the case to respond to President Trump's Justice Department's request to review the case by next Monday. So by next Monday, the plaintiffs will file a response, and then I believe we will have a decision by the Supreme Court in short order, and probably in a week to 10 days, on whether they're going to take the case. The other question remains whether they'll issue the stay, and that's really the hot topic, because that would allow the travel ban to go into effect while the court is considering the case.
So, Byron Henry, we hear a lot of talk and comparison between this list of nations and previous designations by President Obama. So why is there a double standard here, if there is one?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I believe what the courts have done in this case is rather unique, unprecedented, maybe another word, and they've basically taken what would otherwise be a routine administrative designation of a number of countries that do not provide all of the information necessary to properly vet potential travelers to the country, people that want to obtain visas and whatnot and come to this country. There are issues with the information these governments have. First of all, do they even keep the records? And secondly, whether they cooperate with the State Department. And Presidents George W. Bush and Obama had designated 7 countries as those that were not providing necessary cooperation or information to properly vet people coming to this country. So that's rather administrative and routine. The problem is here is when President Trump went the next step and said, we're going to suspend travel into this country by those from these 7 countries, what the courts did was take his prior campaign statements and say, well, unlike other presidents that was doing this for administrative purposes and basically attempting to get more information, it's clear from his campaign statements before he was president, and even some after he became president, that he actually is just anti-Muslim, and he's doing this based on religious discrimination because of an animus towards people of the Muslim faith. And basically they're turning an otherwise benign, facially neutral order that just says, hey, for 90 days we're going to suspend entry by nationals from these countries while we review the process, and said, no, you only did this because you hate Muslims, and therefore it's unconstitutional in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and therefore it's unconstitutional, which is, needless to say, having done First Amendment case law for a long time, it's the most bizarre religious discrimination case I've ever heard of, since these people have never been to the country. Mm-hmm. They're not U.S. citizens. They don't have any connection to America, except they want to come to the United States. So besides the fact that they're using campaign statements, which to my knowledge has also never been used in a case like this to nullify a president's order, it is very interesting, and as I said before, kind of an unprecedented case to to put it mildly.
Yeah, Byron, this is really troublesome, and it seems preposterous. I mean, for every executive order that was issued by Barack Obama or George Bush, both of them had extensive writings and speeches that could have gone through by any of the courts and said, well, they said this at some previous point, and therefore it doesn't matter what the law says, it matters what's going on in their mind. How can we have a rule of law when everything is contextual based on what somebody said during a campaign? That doesn't seem reasonable to me.
Well, you really can't. And just to be clear, using legislative statements by legislators or by the president or by members of the president's cabinet or administrative agency is not foreign to this area of law. What they're used for is, first of all, the president's entitled to deference, as is Congress. So you always defer and assume that all of the president's actions are constitutional and done in good faith, just like you assume Congress is passing constitutional laws and it's done in good faith. So first of all, the courts are not giving the president the deference he's due like they have other presidents. But secondly, these kind of statements are only used when there's an ambiguity or something the court can't figure out from the text of the order or the statute. Therefore, they'll delve into some contemporaneous statements by the policymakers to say, what did they mean when they passed this order or this law? In this case, there is no ambiguity. They're not trying to take an ambiguous order and figure out what the president meant. They're taking an unambiguous order and saying it says X, but he actually thinks Y, so therefore an unambiguous, facially valid order is invalid because the president harbors some sort of religious animus against Muslims, which, as we've talked about, you really can't have a rule of law. And I'll tell you what's troubling is that what other actions can President Trump not take against majority Muslim countries? I mean, can he impose sanctions against the country? I mean, is every single action President Trump takes for the rest of his presidency against the majority Muslim nation unconstitutional because of his supposed animus towards Muslims? That's the real question, and there hasn't been an answer given to that.
So, Byron, let's talk about the Supreme Court and what would follow. If the Supreme Court upholds the lower court, what does that mean going forward for the president and his ability to make these sorts of policy decisions?
If the Supreme Court were to uphold in total, meaning, in other words, just basically carte blanche agree with the lower court, then President Trump is going to be shackled in his ability to deal with majority Muslim nations for the reasons I just mentioned. If all of his actions are going to be tainted by this animus or this hatred of Muslims that he harbors, then he's going to be basically cabined in his discretion in dealing with majority Muslim countries. I suspect what's going to happen is something he alluded to in one of his tweets, is he's just going to give counselors on the ground, the officials granting visas, the discretion to vet these, like what he calls extreme vetting, very difficult vetting, and give them discretion, which means that even if the travel ban's not in effect, it's still going to take a little while longer, and it's going to be much more difficult for these people from these 6 countries to get visas, even if the travel ban's not in effect. So I expect the Department of State to up its vetting requirements internally for these countries, even if there's not a travel ban in effect. And, of course, if the Supreme Court reverses the decision and allows the travel ban to go into effect, then we'll have our answer there.
Finally, Byron Henry, does this indicate to you, as someone who studies this and is involved in law in America, that we have a major problem with our courts, that they would step out on this limb and construct such a premise? Because it certainly does to me. I'm concerned about the courts, even if we win this at the Supreme Court level, that the lower courts have some real problems.
Well, it does expose a not a fatal flaw, but a flaw in the system in this context. When you have a unique president and unique circumstances, the issue is the courts need to continue business as usual and not allow anomalies such as terrorist attacks, wars, or in this case, a president who tweets a lot and has lots to say about some subjects to upset the constitutional balance of powers between the president, the courts, and Congress. Because whatever courts do in this case carries over to future presidents. After President Trump is long gone, the decisions in this case will shape the separation of powers between our branches under the Constitution. So the courts have to be really careful not to make overreaching decisions in an effort to rein in one president that might affect the balance of power for future leaders. So this is a very delicate time, and if we're going to allow the courts to have the power to issue injunctions against the chief executive on national security matters, we have to be assured that courts are going to be very prudential and very conservative, little c, when they actually use that power. And in this case, I think the court may have just overstepped its bounds a little bit in trying to rein in what they consider to be a unique, possibly even a rogue president.
Byron, if people want to reach you online, would you tell us where they can do that?
Certainly. You can find me at www.solidcounsel.com.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us once again on The Schilling Show, Byron Henry.